On the morning of June 7, 1944, in the rugged mountain passes of central Italy, Sergeant Klaus Bergmann of the German Armored Reconnaissance Unit stood beside his idling Panzer IV tank and studied the narrow road ahead with growing unease. The path, carved through dense oak forests and limestone cliffs, barely allowed room for two vehicles to pass, and intelligence reports had assured his column commander that partisan activity in this sector was minimal. What Bergmann and the 43 other men in his mechanized column could not possibly know was that within the next 6 hours, their entire advance would be brought to a complete standstill, not by Allied artillery, not by air superiority, but by a single obstacle constructed using methods that predated European civilization by thousands of years. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how one man, drawing on ancestral knowledge passed down through generations, would demonstrate that the most sophisticated military technology of the 20th century remained vulnerable to the oldest tactical wisdom humanity possessed. Corporal James Whitehorse of the United States Army had been raised on the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico, where his grandfather had taught him survival skills that white settlers had dismissed as primitive folklore. Now attached to a special reconnaissance unit operating behind German lines in Italy, Whitehorse crouched in the underbrush overlooking the mountain road and assessed the situation with eyes trained to read landscape the way other men read books. The intelligence officer back at camp had been explicit in his briefing that morning. A German mechanized column consisting of 9 tanks, 12 half-tracks, and various support vehicles would be moving through this pass within 48 hours. The mission was straightforward on paper, but nearly impossible in execution. Delay or disrupt the column long enough for Allied forces to reposition artillery batteries 15 kilometers to the south. Whitehorse had exactly 36 hours to prepare, and his entire team consisted of himself and 2 other soldiers. Private First Class Danny Sullivan from Boston, a demolitions expert whose hands shook slightly whenever he handled explosives after a close call in North Africa, and Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, who spoke 4 languages and could navigate by stars alone. Together, the 3 men possessed exactly 12 anti-tank mines, 40 pounds of plastic explosive, 3 Bangalore torpedoes, and a collection of standard infantry weapons. Against 9 Panzer tanks and several hundred German soldiers, these resources were laughably inadequate. Sullivan voiced what all 3 were thinking as they surveyed the narrow pass that evening. "We could mine the road," he said, "but they will just clear it in an hour, maybe 2. They have engineers, detectors, all the equipment." Chen nodded in agreement, adding that even if they managed to disable 1 or 2 vehicles, the Germans would simply push the wrecks aside and continue. The timeline demanded something more elegant, more paralyzing, something that would create a psychological impact beyond mere physical obstruction. Whitehorse stood silent for nearly 10 minutes, studying the towering oak trees that lined both sides of the mountain road, their massive trunks reaching heights of over 20 meters. His grandfather's voice echoed in memory, describing how Apache warriors in the 1800s had defended their territory against Mexican cavalry, using the landscape itself as a weapon. The old man had once shown him a drawing in a history book, a simple diagram that depicted a technique so elementary that modern military tacticians never considered it. Yet in the right circumstances, with the right understanding of physics and psychology, it possessed devastating effectiveness. That night, Whitehorse explained his plan to his 2 skeptical companions. They would construct what his people called a deadfall trap, but on a scale never attempted before. The principle was ancient and brutally simple: suspend a massive weight above a pathway, rig a trigger mechanism, and let gravity do the work. But instead of catching game animals, they would catch tanks. Sullivan laughed at first, then stopped when he saw the absolute seriousness in Whitehorse's expression. "You want to drop a tree on a Panzer column," the Boston native said slowly. "That is insane." Chen was more analytical in his skepticism. "Even if we could cut down trees large enough to matter," he said, "how do we position them? How do we ensure they fall at exactly the right moment? And most critically, how do we prevent the Germans from simply cutting through and continuing?" One tree, even a massive one, is just an inconvenience to an engineering unit with saws and explosives. Whitehorse smiled for the first time that evening. "We are not dropping one tree," he said. "We are dropping 17 of them. And we are doing it in a way that makes clearing them more dangerous than leaving them in place." Over the next 36 hours, the three men worked with an intensity born of desperation and ingenuity. Whitehorse selected 17 oak trees with trunks ranging from 1.2 to nearly 2 meters in diameter, each positioned along a 300-meter stretch of road where the mountain pass narrowed to barely 8 meters wide. The trees stood on both sides of the path, their massive root systems anchored in rocky soil that had supported them for over 2 centuries. Using hand saws to avoid the noise of mechanical equipment, they spent the first night making strategic cuts in each trunk, removing just enough wood to weaken the structural integrity without causing immediate collapse. The work was exhausting and precise. Too much cutting, and the trees would fall prematurely. Too little, and they would not fall at all when triggered. Sullivan contributed his demolitions expertise by placing small-shaped charges at key stress points in each trunk. Charges that would not destroy the trees, but would sever the final supporting wood fibers at exactly the right moment. The charges were connected by detonation cord in a complex web that Chen mapped meticulously on paper, creating a sequence that would cause the trees to fall in a specific pattern. The first 3 trees would fall across the road nearly simultaneously, creating an initial barrier approximately 9 meters high and 70 meters long. Then, at intervals of 30 seconds, additional trees would fall both in front of and behind the German column, extending the barrier and trapping vehicles in a segment of road where maneuvering was impossible. But the true genius of Whitehorse's design lay not in the falling trees themselves, but in how they would fall. Each tree was rigged to drop at a precise angle, causing the massive trunks to interlock with each other like a giant game of pickup sticks. The root systems, torn from the ground by the tremendous force of the fall, would create additional obstacles filled with rocks, soil, and tangled wood. Most critically, Whitehorse had carefully placed their limited supply of anti-tank mines and explosives throughout the fallen timber, not to destroy vehicles, but to make any attempt at clearing the obstacle incredibly dangerous. Any German engineer trying to cut through the barrier or use cables to pull trees aside would risk triggering hidden charges that would shower the area with wooden shrapnel and cause additional trees to shift unpredictably. Chen understood the psychological component immediately. "They will not know which trees are safe to cut and which are trapped," he said with growing admiration. "Every saw cut, every cable attached becomes a potentially fatal action. It transforms a simple engineering problem into a lethal puzzle that requires hours of careful probing and detection." Whitehorse nodded. "And every hour they spend here is another hour for our artillery to get into position. We do not need to stop them permanently. We just need to stop them long enough." By dawn on June 9th, the trap was set. The 3 men concealed themselves in prepared positions on the hillside above the road, with detonation controls and rifles ready. They did not have long to wait. At 0700 hours, the rumble of diesel engines echoed through the mountain pass. Sergeant Bergman's column appeared around the distant bend, moving at the cautious pace demanded by the narrow road and potential partisan ambushes. 9 Panzer IV tanks led the formation, their long 75mm guns traversing slowly from side to side. Behind them came the half-tracks carrying infantry, followed by trucks loaded with fuel, ammunition, and supplies. The entire column stretched nearly half a kilometer. Bergman rode in the commander's cupola of the lead tank, scanning the tree line with binoculars. Something about this stretch of road troubled him, though he could not articulate exactly what. The forest seemed undisturbed, no signs of enemy activity, no unusual sounds. Yet his instincts, honed through 3 years of combat across multiple theaters, whispered warnings. He ordered the column to slow even further, bringing the lead tanks to a crawl of less than 10 kilometers per hour. This caution would save his life, but also ensure his vehicles were perfectly positioned for what came next. When the lead tank reached the precise center point marked by Whitehorse's calculations, the Apache corporal pressed the detonation trigger. For a heartbeat, nothing seemed to happen. Then 17 sharp cracks echoed through the forest almost simultaneously, like a sequence of rifle shots. The shaped charges severed the final supporting wood in each carefully weakened trunk. For another second, the massive trees stood motionless, as if contemplating their centuries of growth before succumbing to gravity. Then they began to fall. The sound was unlike anything Bergman had experienced in the conflict. Not the sharp explosion of artillery or the scream of aircraft, but a deep, grinding roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. He looked up just as the first massive oak, a giant nearly 2 meters thick and 25 meters tall, toppled across the road directly ahead of his tank. The impact when it struck the ground sent vibrations through the rock that Bergman could feel in his bones. A cloud of dust, leaves and small branches erupted around the fallen trunk, momentarily obscuring visibility. Before the German commander could process what was happening, 2 more trees crashed down behind his position, their massive weights hitting with such force that several men were knocked off their feet by the shock waves alone. Then the cascade began in earnest. Tree after tree toppled in a carefully orchestrated sequence, each one adding to a growing barrier that transformed the narrow mountain pass into an impassable maze of timber and torn earth. The interlocking trunks created a wall of wood that rose nearly 10 meters high in places, a barrier that extended over 200 meters of roadway. Inside his tank, Bergman shouted orders into the radio, trying to assess the situation as dust and debris continued to settle. His column was now divided into 3 segments. 3 tanks, including his own, were trapped in a pocket, roughly 70 meters long, wedged between walls of fallen timber that blocked both forward and reverse movement. 4 tanks behind them were similarly boxed in, with no room to turn around on the narrow road. The remaining vehicles, including most of the infantry and supply trucks, were stuck at the rear of the column, unable to advance or provide support. Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann, commander of the 2nd tank, climbed from his vehicle and stood staring at the barrier with an expression that mixed disbelief with grudging admiration. "Herr Sergeant," he called to Bergman, who had also dismounted to survey the disaster. "This was no accident. This was planned, engineered. Look at how the trees have fallen, how they interlock. This is a deliberate trap." Bergman nodded slowly, his tactical mind already working through options, each one more difficult than the last. The barrier was too high and too dense for tanks to simply push through. The interlocked trunks would resist direct force, potentially damaging tank tracks or suspension if they attempted to ram their way clear. The column's engineering officer, Lieutenant Dieter Schmidt, arrived at the front after climbing over several of the fallen trunks. His assessment was grim. "Herr Sergeant," he began, removing his cap to wipe sweat from his forehead, "clearing this will require significant time and resources. These are old-growth oaks, some weighing 40,000 kilograms or more. We will need to cut them into sections small enough to move, which means establishing safe working areas, bringing up our engineering equipment, and proceeding with extreme caution in case the partisans have trapped any of the timber." Bergman asked the question everyone was thinking. "How long?" Schmidt hesitated before answering. "Under normal circumstances, perhaps 12 hours of continuous work. But if we must check each tree for explosives and booby traps, factor in the narrow working space, and the risk of additional trees being destabilized as we remove others, I would estimate a minimum of 36 hours, possibly 48. The psychological impact of the barrier extended beyond mere physical obstruction. German soldiers who had faced artillery barrages and air raids with stoic professionalism found themselves unnerved by this silent, massive wall of wood that had appeared in seconds. There was something primal and unsettling about being trapped not by advanced technology but by gravity and timber. The forest itself seemed to have turned hostile, an enemy that required no bullets or explosives to achieve its objective. From their concealed position on the hillside, Whitehorse, Chen and Sullivan watched the German response with professional satisfaction. The plan had worked even better than hoped. The column was not merely stopped, but psychologically shaken. Through binoculars, they could see the careful, tentative way German engineers approached the barrier, the constant checking and rechecking for explosives, the heated discussions among officers about how to proceed. Sullivan whispered that they should have brought popcorn for the show. Chen quietly pointed out that their real work was just beginning. They needed to ensure the Germans remained trapped here for at least 36 more hours, and that meant active harassment to slow any clearing attempts. Over the next 2 days, the 3 Allied soldiers conducted a campaign of psychological operation that transformed an engineering challenge into a nightmare of uncertainty. They did not fire their rifles or launch direct attacks. Instead, they made their presence known through subtle, terrorizing means. A single shot would ring out whenever German engineers began working on a particular tree, forcing them to take cover and lose precious minutes. The shot never hit anyone, but it created the impression of snipers covering the entire area. Small explosive charges, no larger than grenades, would detonate in the forest at random intervals, suggesting a much larger partisan force surrounding the trapped column. At night, Chen used his linguistic skills to broadcast messages in German through a captured radio, providing precise details about the column's composition and position, implying that Allied artillery was being directed toward their coordinates. The effect on German morale was significant. Soldiers who had engaged across Europe with discipline and effectiveness now jumped at shadows, convinced that every tree concealed an enemy sniper, every section of fallen timber hid explosives. The engineering work proceeded with painful slowness, each cut requiring extensive checking with metal detectors and visual inspection. When they did begin moving sections of trunk, the hidden charges Whitehorse had placed activated in ways designed to maximize fear rather than casualties. A shaped charge would detonate when a cable was attached to a log, sending splinters flying but positioned to injure rather than cause serious harm. Another explosive would trigger when a saw cut reached a certain depth, again causing mostly noise and minor wounds, but creating the impression that the entire barrier was a deadly puzzle. Bergmann found himself in an impossible situation. His orders were to reach the defensive positions 30 kilometers south within 72 hours to reinforce a critical sector. Those hours were slipping away while his powerful armored column sat immobilized by timber. He radioed for air support to drop supplies and requested engineering reinforcements. But the mountainous terrain and Allied air superiority made such assistance difficult. Aircraft attempting to reach the column were intercepted by American fighters. Additional engineering units would take days to arrive by the circuitous mountain roads. On the second day, Bergmann made the difficult decision to attempt an alternative route. Scout teams reported a logging road, approximately 2 kilometers to the west, that might allow the column to bypass the blocked pass entirely. But moving the tanks and vehicles cross-country to reach that road would require hours of preparation and risk damaging the very tracks and suspension systems they depended on. Worse, they would have to abandon several vehicles, including 2 tanks, that had developed mechanical problems and could not manage the rough terrain. The alternative was to continue the agonizingly slow process of clearing the barrier. Lieutenant Hoffmann, who had initially admired the trap's engineering, now cursed it with impressive creativity. Whoever planned this, he said to Bergmann that evening, understands not just tactics but psychology. They have turned our strength against us. Our tanks are useless, our training is useless, our discipline is being eroded by an enemy we cannot see or engage, all of it neutralized by wooden trunks and the fear of what might be hidden within them. It is masterful and infuriating. By the afternoon of June 11th, Bergmann's column had managed to clear approximately 40% of the barrier. The work was exhausting and nerve-wracking, with every small victory feeling hollow because of the time it consumed. German soldiers had indeed discovered several of the hidden charges, confirming their fears that the entire obstacle was trapped. The discovery of explosives necessitated even more careful work, further slowing progress. Meanwhile, the harassment from Whitehorse's team continued with disciplined precision, never escalating to direct engagement, but maintaining constant pressure on German nerves. Then, on the evening of the 11th, the sound that Bergmann had been dreading echoed across the mountains. The distinctive whistle and impact of heavy artillery, still distant, but growing closer. Allied forward observers had used the 2-day delay to position their guns and begin ranging fire. The shells fell several kilometers away initially, but Bergmann knew what this meant. The time his column had been bought by those 3 Allied soldiers and their wooden trap had allowed enemy forces to prepare positions that would make the rest of his advance incredibly costly, perhaps impossible. Sergeant Chen, observing from the hillside with his remaining companions, allowed himself a rare smile. "The artillery sounds mean our job is done," he said quietly. "They are delayed enough." Whitehorse nodded, already preparing to withdraw from their positions before the Germans, now with nothing to lose, launched a major effort to find and eliminate their harassers. Sullivan gathered their remaining equipment, his hands steady now, the mission's success having restored his confidence. Before they slipped away into the forest, Whitehorse took one last look at the massive barrier of fallen timber and trapped German vehicles below. His grandfather would have appreciated the symmetry of it all. Ancient tactics defeating modern machinery. Patience and understanding of natural forces overcoming industrial might. The old man had often said that the best warriors were not those with the most powerful weapons, but those who understood how to turn the landscape itself into an ally. Today, on a narrow mountain pass in central Italy, that wisdom had proven as relevant as it had been centuries ago on the deserts and mountains of New Mexico. The German column finally cleared the last of the barrier on the morning of June 12th, nearly 60 hours after the initial trap had been sprung. They resumed their advance, but the damage was done. The positions they were meant to reinforce had already been overrun by Allied forces. The artillery that had been repositioned during their delay made the rest of their journey a costly retreat. Of the 9 tanks that had entered that mountain pass, only 5 remained operational by the time they reached what was left of their defensive line. Bergmann survived the conflict and eventually wrote about his experiences in Italy. In his memoir, published in 1957, he devoted an entire chapter to what he called the tree trap incident. He described it as one of the most frustrating and humbling moments of his military career, not because of the physical damage inflicted, but because of what it represented. "We had the most advanced armored vehicles in the world at that time," he wrote. "We had training, discipline, and experience. Yet 3 men with saws, rope, and basic explosives stopped us more effectively than Allied air power or armor had managed in previous engagements. It was a lesson in humility and a reminder that technological superiority alone does not guarantee victory." For Corporal Whitehorse, the mission became something of a legend within the Special Reconnaissance Units. He was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor device, though the full details of the operation remained classified for many years. After the conflict, he returned to New Mexico and eventually became a teacher on the Mescalero Apache reservation, where he shared not only modern skills, but also the traditional knowledge that had proven so valuable. He would tell his students that their heritage contained wisdom that the modern world had forgotten. Lessons about working with nature rather than against it, about patience, observation, and understanding systems in their totality. The strategic impact of that 2-day delay was studied extensively by military historians after the conflict. Allied records showed that the German column's failure to reach its intended positions on schedule contributed to the collapse of an entire defensive sector, allowing Allied forces to advance 12 kilometers further than anticipated, with far fewer casualties than projected. One military analyst calculated that the delayed column might have inflicted an estimated 500 Allied casualties had it arrived on time and established proper defensive positions. Instead, the sector fell with only 47 Allied losses. The ratio of effect to resources expended was remarkable. 3 soldiers, using materials that cost virtually nothing and drawing on knowledge as old as human civilization, had achieved what would have required significant air support or armored units under conventional tactical thinking. There was also a broader lesson that rippled through military thinking in subsequent decades. The incident demonstrated that asymmetric operations, the use of unconventional tactics by smaller forces against larger ones, could achieve outsized strategic effects when applied with intelligence and creativity. It validated the concept of special operations forces and the value of soldiers with diverse backgrounds who brought unique perspectives to tactical problems. Whitehorse's Apache heritage, rather than being seen as irrelevant to modern engagement, had provided exactly the kind of innovative thinking that conventional military training could not replicate. Lieutenant Schmidt, the German engineering officer who had struggled to clear the barrier, later wrote in a technical journal article that the incident revolutionized his understanding of obstacle creation. He noted that the trap's true effectiveness lay not in its physical mass, but in its psychological complexity. The interlocking trees created uncertainty at every level, he observed. We could not simply apply force or standard clearing procedures. Each decision carried risk. Each action could trigger unknown consequences. It transformed a straightforward engineering task into a deadly puzzle that consumed time and morale equally. Modern military forces would do well to study such elegant applications of basic principles. The logging road that Bergman had considered as an alternative route was itself discovered to have been prepared by Whitehorse and his team with additional, smaller obstacles. They had not had time to execute that backup plan, but reconnaissance after the German withdrawal revealed felled trees and prepared charges along that route as well. Whitehorse had anticipated the German commander's thinking and prepared contingencies that would have further delayed any bypass attempt. This multi-layered approach to tactical planning, thinking several moves ahead like a chess player, became another subject of study in special operations training programs. Private Sullivan, whose hands had shaken at the beginning of the mission, went on to complete over 30 special operations behind enemy lines before the conflict's end. He credited the tree trap mission with restoring his confidence and teaching him that explosive charges did not always need to destroy in order to be effective. Sometimes, he later said, the threat of explosion is more powerful than the explosion itself. It is all about using fear as a precision tool. So after the conflict, he worked in commercial demolition in Boston, always emphasizing safety and psychological understanding of how people respond to danger. Staff Sergeant Chen's linguistic abilities and his role in the psychological harassment campaign led to his recruitment for intelligence work in the Pacific Theater during the final months. His broadcasts that had convinced German soldiers they were surrounded by a much larger force became a case study in psychological operations. He eventually worked for the State Department during the early Cold War period, applying similar psychological principles to political contexts. He remained lifelong friends with Whitehorse, the two men recognizing in each other a shared understanding of how cultural knowledge and modern tactics could complement each other. The oak forest where the trap was set remained largely undisturbed after the conflict. Local Italian residents, when they learned the full story decades later, chose to leave several of the massive stumps and root systems in place as an informal memorial. The site became a minor historical landmark, occasionally visited by military historians and tactical students studying unconventional methods. A small plaque installed in 1987 marks the location with simple words in both Italian and English, describing it as the place where ancient wisdom and modern engagement intersected with decisive effect. For the soldiers of Bergman's column who survived, the 2 days spent trapped in that mountain pass remained a vivid memory of frustration and grudging respect. In the 1960s and 70s, when veterans from both sides began participating in historical forums and reunions, several German veterans sought out information about the Allied soldiers responsible for the tree trap. They wanted to meet the men who had outwitted them so thoroughly, to shake hands and discuss the tactical brilliance of the operation. Whitehorse, by then in his 50s and teaching full-time on the reservation, agreed to meet with a few of these former adversaries. The meetings were cordial and respectful, old soldiers recognizing professionalism regardless of which side they had served. One German veteran, a former tank driver named Josef Kraus, made the journey to New Mexico specifically to meet Whitehorse. Over coffee, with the stark beauty of the New Mexico landscape surrounding them, the two men discussed the mission. Kraus admitted that he had been terrified during those 2 days, convinced that the forest itself was hostile, that danger waited in every shadow. Whitehorse listened with quiet dignity, then explained the principles behind the trap, the Apache understanding of landscape and psychology, the careful planning that had gone into every detail. Kraus left the meeting with a profound appreciation for both the tactical achievement and the cultural knowledge that had made it possible. The story of the tree trap was eventually declassified and published in military journals in the 1970s. Though many details were still omitted for security reasons, it became required reading at the United States Army Ranger School and was included in curricula at various special operations training programs worldwide. The basic principles demonstrated by the mission: using environment as a weapon, creating psychological impact beyond physical damage, Thinking in terms of system effects rather than individual targets became foundational concepts in modern special operations doctrine. Whitehorse himself remained humble about the achievement throughout his life. When interviewed for a documentary project in the 1980s, he insisted that he had simply applied knowledge that his grandfather and countless ancestors before him had understood intuitively. "I did not invent anything new," he said. "I just remembered something old. My grandfather taught me to observe, to understand how things work together, to respect the power of nature and time. Those lessons served me well in Italy, but they serve anyone well anywhere if they pay attention." The tactical manual that eventually included analysis of the tree trap operation noted that its success depended on a unique combination of factors: cultural knowledge that provided alternative tactical perspectives, deep understanding of physics and engineering principles, patience in preparation and execution, psychological insight into how enemy forces would respond, and perhaps most importantly, the creativity to see possibilities that conventional military training would overlook. The manual emphasized that modern military forces needed diversity not just for ethical reasons but for tactical effectiveness. Different backgrounds, different experiences, and different cultural perspectives could generate innovative solutions to complex problems. In 2003, nearly 60 years after the mission, a military history professor traveled to the Mescalero Apache reservation to interview Whitehorse's family. His children and grandchildren shared stories he had told them over the years, revealing how he had framed the experience as a lesson about respecting ancestral knowledge. The tree trap's legacy extended beyond military applications. Engineers and disaster response specialists studied the principles of the interlocking timber barrier when designing temporary obstacles and emergency blockades. The psychological aspects of the harassment campaign influenced law enforcement and security protocols for managing situations where direct confrontation was counterproductive. The intersection of ancient ecological knowledge and modern tactical problems became a small but recognized field of study, with Whitehorse's mission serving as the primary historical example. For the broader military community, the incident served as a reminder that engagement was fundamentally about human ingenuity rather than technological superiority. The German Panzer IV tanks, trapped by those falling oaks, represented hundreds of thousands of hours of engineering development and industrial production. Each tank had required specialized steel alloys, precision manufacturing, trained crews, and extensive logistical support to place on that Italian mountain road. All of that investment in technology and training had been negated by 3 men with handsaws and basic explosives, guided by knowledge that required no factories or laboratories to produce. The mission also highlighted the importance of clear objectives and proportional responses. Whitehorse and his team had not tried to destroy the German column, which would have been impossible with their limited resources. They had simply needed to delay it, and they had designed their trap specifically for that achievable goal. Too many military operations failed because forces attempted objectives beyond their capabilities. The tree trap succeeded because it was perfectly scaled to what 3 soldiers could actually accomplish with the time and resources available. Looking back across the decades from the perspective of the 21st century, the tree trap incident on that Italian mountain pass in June 1944 seems almost impossibly simple. Yet its simplicity was precisely its strength. In an era of increasingly complex military technology and doctrine, it demonstrated that fundamental principles, deception, surprise, psychological impact, and creative use of terrain remained paramount. These principles did not require advanced technology to implement effectively. They required intelligence, courage, and the willingness to think beyond conventional approaches. The 17 oak trees that fell across that narrow mountain road achieved a strategic effect far beyond their physical mass. They bought time for Allied artillery to reposition. They saved hundreds of potential casualties by preventing a German reinforcement from reaching its defensive positions. They demonstrated the effectiveness of unconventional tactics and validated the importance of diverse perspectives in military planning. Most importantly, they proved that ancient wisdom and modern engagement were not contradictions, but complementary approaches to the same fundamental challenges of strategy, tactics, and human nature. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.